Before we descend into the darkness, I want to ask a favour. If you enjoy this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference. And if you'd like, comment what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. Now let's begin. We begin with something so familiar, it barely registers as an assumption. Everything has a beginning. The chair you sit in was assembled in a factory. The words you speak were learned from others who learned them before. The thoughts forming in your mind right now arise from memories, experiences, and neural patterns that developed over time. This intuition runs deep. When we encounter anything, an object, an idea, a melody, we naturally ask where it came from. We trace causes backward, link by link, confident that somewhere at the end of that chain lies an origin point, a moment of creation, an act of invention, a first cause that started everything else rolling forward. The Bootstrap Paradox asks us to imagine something different. It describes a situation where this comfortable chain of cause and effect forms not a line but a circle, where the thing we're trying to explain exists without ever having been created, where every step leads logically to the next but the loop, as a whole, has no beginning. The paradox gets its name from the old expression about pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, an impossible feat of self-generation. And like that image, the Bootstrap Paradox presents something that seems to generate itself from nothing, not through magic or violation of logic, but through the strange geometry of circular time. At first glance, the paradox might sound like a mere curiosity, a puzzle for philosophers or science fiction writers to play with during idle hours, but it touches something deeper than entertainment. It challenges one of our most basic cognitive tools, the assumption that explanation means tracing backward to something earlier, something prior, something that came first. The Bootstrap Paradox suggests that in a universe where time travel is possible, some things might be fully explained without ever having a first moment. They exist, they're consistent. Every part of their existence makes sense in relation to the other parts, but they have no origin outside themselves. The core structure of the paradox is remarkably simple. Imagine an object or piece of information that travels backward through time. Once in the past, it participates in events that eventually lead to its own future existence. Then at the appointed moment, it travels backward again, closing the loop. The future depends on the past because the object must exist in the past to cause the future. But the past depends on the future because the object arrives from the future. Neither comes first. Neither is the foundation upon which the other rests. They form a circle, a loop that is internally consistent, each event following causally from the previous one, yet missing the external point of origin we instinctively expect. To make this less abstract, consider a concrete example, one gentle enough to ease us into the paradox's strange territory. Picture a time traveller who arrives in the past carrying a book, not just any book, but a collection of mathematical proofs, elegant solutions to problems that have puzzled scholars for years. The time traveller approaches a mathematician working in obscurity, someone talented but struggling, and hands over the book. "Study this," the time traveller says. "These proofs will change everything." The mathematician opens the book. The proofs inside are beautiful, clear, correct. They solve problems the mathematician has been wrestling with for months. Over the following years, the mathematician studies these proofs, absorbs them completely, and eventually publishes them under their own name. The publication is celebrated. The proofs become famous, studied by students, reproduced in textbooks, preserved in libraries. Decades pass. The book containing these proofs becomes a standard reference, printed and reprinted, passed from generation to generation. Eventually, a copy of this book finds its way into the hands of someone who will one day become a time traveller. They study it fascinated. They memorise its contents, And when they finally gain access to time travel technology, they choose to bring this particular book back to the past, to the mathematician at that crucial moment of struggle. They become the time traveller in our story, completing the loop. Now ask the central question, who created those mathematical proofs? The mathematician? No, the mathematician received them from the time traveller and merely studied and published what was already complete. The time traveller? No, the time traveller learned the proofs from the published book and carried them backward, unchanged. The proofs exist in a closed causal loop. Every step in their journey can be explained by reference to earlier steps in the sequence. The time traveller brings them because they learned them from the book. The book exists because the mathematician published it. The mathematician published it because the time traveller brought it. Each link in the chain is perfectly accounted for. Yet there is no moment of creation, no spark of original authorship. The information simply exists, circulating through time like blood through a closed system, never entering from outside. This is the essence of the Bootstrap Paradox. Something exists, and its existence is fully explained by a chain of causes, but that chain forms a loop rather than terminating in an origin. The information in the book was not created at any point in the timeline. It has no author in the usual sense. It is, in a real and troubling way, self-caused. Let's shift from information to physical objects, because the paradox works just as well, and perhaps feels even stranger, when applied to something you could hold in your hands. Imagine a pocket watch, old-fashioned and intricate, with delicate gears and a beautifully engraved case. Someone discovers this watch, perhaps in an antique shop, or inherited from a relative. They cherish it, care for it, have it repaired when necessary using its own design as a guide. Years pass. Eventually, this person gains access to time travel. For reasons sentimental or practical, they decide to send the watch backward in time, perhaps to their younger self, or to an ancestor, or simply to a point where it will be found and appreciated. The watch arrives in the past. Someone finds it. Maybe the same person at a younger age. Maybe someone else entirely. That person cherishes it, cares for it, eventually passes it on, or finds a way to send it backward in time. The watch loops. It is found, preserved, and sent back. Found, preserved, and sent back. Each cycle proceeds logically. Each person who possesses the watch has a clear explanation for where it came from. They found it, or received it, or inherited it. Each person who sends it back has a clear motive and method. The watch's journey through time forms a consistent history. But when was it made? When did a craftsperson sit at a workbench, shaping metal and glass into this particular configuration? The answer, according to the loop, is never. The watch was not manufactured. It was not assembled from raw materials at any point in the timeline. It simply exists, cycling through the same span of years over and over, neither created nor destroyed, only moved. Every moment of its existence can be explained. It's here now because it was there then, and it was there then because it will be here now. But the explanation is circular. The watch is self-sustaining. This reveals something important about the Bootstrap Paradox. It doesn't violate causality in the sense of having effects without causes. Every event has a cause. The mathematician publishes the proofs because the time traveller brought them. The time traveller brings them because the mathematician published them. The watch exists here because it was sent from there. It was sent from there because it exists here. Causality is preserved. What's violated, or at least deeply challenged, is our expectation that causal chains must have a beginning, a foundation, a first cause that wasn't itself caused by something later. Why does this feel so wrong? Why does the paradox generate such cognitive discomfort? To understand the discomfort, we need to examine our intuitions about causality and what we might call the accounting of existence. In ordinary experience, the universe operates on a kind of bookkeeping system. If you want a book to exist, someone must write it. If you want a watch to exist, someone must make it. Information must be generated, objects must be assembled, energy must be expended. The universe keeps accounts. Nothing appears without being paid for in the currency of prior causes, prior events, prior expenditures of energy and effort. We might not always know what those prior causes were, but we're confident they existed. The universe doesn't run a deficit. It doesn't give out books or watches or ideas for free. The Bootstrap Paradox appears to violate this accounting principle. The mathematical proofs exist and circulate through time, but nobody ever did the work of creating them. The watch exists and passes from hand to hand, but nobody ever expended the energy and skill to craft it from raw materials. The paradox seems to generate something from nothing, not in a single magical moment, but through a structure that avoids the need for generation entirely. It's as if the universe has found a loophole in its own bookkeeping. If time can loop, then causes can form circles. And if causes can form circles, then things can exist without needing to be paid for by a prior act of creation. This isn't quite getting something for nothing, because the object or information does exist and does participate in causal processes. It's more like having an account that always shows a balance, but never had an initial deposit. The books balance at every moment. The watch is here because it was there because it will be here. But the system as a whole seems to have skipped the step where value entered the system in the first place. Our discomfort with this situation reveals something about how deeply we rely on directional causality. We're accustomed to thinking of time as having a forward flow and of cause and effect as respecting that flow. Causes precede effects, origins come before consequences, foundations are laid before structures are built on them. The Bootstrap Paradox preserves the local structure of causality. Each event is caused by a prior event, but breaks the global structure by forming a loop, and our intuitions, tuned to linear causal chains, rebel against the loop even when we can't point to a specific logical error. It's worth pausing here to distinguish the Bootstrap Paradox from another famous time travel puzzle, the Grandfather Paradox. The Grandfather Paradox asks what happens if you travel back in time and prevent your own existence, perhaps by interfering with your grandparents' meeting. The paradox is that you could only travel back in time if you existed, but if you succeeded in preventing your existence, you couldn't have travelled back to prevent it. This is a contradiction in the logical sense. It implies you both existed and didn't exist, which is impossible. The Bootstrap Paradox is different. It doesn't create a logical contradiction. There's no statement of the form A and not A. Instead, it creates a causal structure that is internally consistent but lacks an external origin. The mathematical proofs exist and have a complete history. The watch exists and has a complete history. Nothing in the timeline contradicts anything else. Every event flows logically into the next. The paradox is not one of logical impossibility, but of conceptual strangeness. A complete, coherent history that nevertheless seems to be missing something we instinctively think should be there. This distinction matters because it affects how we might respond to the paradox. The Grandfather Paradox suggests that certain time travel scenarios simply cannot occur. They lead to contradiction and therefore must be prevented by the structure of reality itself, perhaps through quantum effects or the nature of time. The Bootstrap Paradox doesn't obviously require that kind of prohibition. It's logically coherent. The question is whether the universe permits logically coherent but originless causal loops, or whether there's some deeper principle that rules them out, even though they don't generate formal contradictions. Let's explore some common responses to the Bootstrap Paradox, approaches that different thinkers have taken to make sense of these strange loops without insisting they're simply impossible. The first response is to embrace self-consistency as a fundamental principle of time travel. According to this view, if time travel is possible, then the universe must be arranged such that only consistent histories can occur. You cannot kill your grandfather because that would be inconsistent with your existence, Similarly, if a bootstrap loop is consistent, if the watch really does loop without creating any contradictions, then the loop is permitted, even if it lacks an external origin. This approach has been developed most carefully in physics by researchers thinking about closed time-like curves, which are solutions to Einstein's equations of general relativity that allow for time loops. In general relativity, time and space are woven together into a four-dimensional fabric called spacetime. Normally, as you move through this fabric, you move forward in time, but certain configurations of mass and energy, rotating black holes for instance, or certain theoretical constructions involving exotic matter, can curve spacetime so severely that world lines, the paths objects follow through spacetime, can loop back on themselves. An object following such a path would travel forward in its own experience, moment by moment, but eventually return to an earlier moment in external time, creating a closed loop. If such loops are possible, then the universe must somehow ensure that what happens in the loop is consistent with itself. The physicist Igor Novikov and others have proposed what's sometimes called the Novikov self-consistency principle. The universe will arrange events such that any action taken by a time traveller was always part of the timeline. You can't change the past because your attempt to change it was always part of the past. Any causal loop that forms must be self-consistent. Under this principle, bootstrap loops are not errors or impossibilities, but permitted structures. If a book of mathematical proofs loops through time, then that's simply what happens in that particular region of spacetime. The proofs exist without an external author because the structure of spacetime allows a closed loop, and the contents of the loop are self-consistent. There's no contradiction, no violation of physics, only a violation of our expectation that everything must have an origin outside itself. The cost of this view is conceptual rather than logical. You must accept that some things in the universe simply are, without having been created. They participate in causal processes, they cause effects and are caused by earlier events, but they exist within a loop rather than at the end of a chain. Origins, in these cases, are replaced by cycles. The question, where did it come from, has no answer in the usual sense, only a description of how it moves through the loop. This might feel unsatisfying, but it's not obviously unreasonable. After all, physicists have long grappled with the question of origins in other contexts. What caused the Big Bang? Some models suggest the Big Bang was the beginning of time itself, in which case asking what came before is like asking what's north of the North Pole, a category error. Other models propose eternal inflation or cyclical cosmologies, where the universe has no single beginning. The point is that physics has already encountered situations where our intuitive demand for an ultimate origin may not apply. The Bootstrap Paradox simply extends this conceptual challenge to localized loops within spacetime rather than to the cosmos as a whole. A second response to the Bootstrap Paradox involves the idea of branching timelines or parallel universes. According to this view, time travel doesn't occur within a single fixed timeline, but instead involves movement between different branches of reality. When something travels backward in time, it might not arrive in the same timeline it left from, but rather in a different, parallel version of history. Applied to the Bootstrap Paradox, this approach suggests that the watch or the book of proofs doesn't truly create itself within a single timeline. Instead, it travels from one branch to another. In timeline A, someone creates the watch through ordinary means. A craftsperson makes it. It's purchased. It eventually falls into the hands of a time traveller who sends it backward to timeline B. In timeline B, the watch appears from nowhere, as far as the inhabitants of that timeline can tell, but it has an origin in timeline A. The loop we observe in timeline B is not genuinely originless. It's just that the origin lies in a different branch of the multiverse. This approach has the advantage of preserving our intuition that everything must have an origin somewhere. The cost is accepting a vast, perhaps infinite, proliferation of parallel timelines. Every time travel event splits reality into branches or connects to already existing branches, creating a structure far more complex than a single linear history. The universe's bookkeeping is preserved. Every watch was made somewhere, every proof was thought up by someone, but the accounts are spread across multiple parallel realities. This branching model draws support from certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, particularly the many worlds interpretation proposed by Hugh Everett. According to this interpretation, every quantum measurement causes the universe to branch into multiple parallel versions, each representing a different possible outcome. If time travel involves quantum processes, and most realistic mechanisms for time travel, such as traversable wormholes, would involve quantum physics at some level, then perhaps it naturally connects to different branches of the quantum multiverse, rather than looping within a single timeline. Under this view, the Bootstrap Paradox isn't really a paradox at all. What appears to be a closed loop from the perspective of timeline B is actually a connection between two different timelines. The watch has a history, it's just not entirely contained within the timeline where we're observing it. The strangeness is softened, replaced by the different strangeness of a branching tree-like structure of parallel realities. The third major response to the Bootstrap Paradox is skepticism about whether such loops can actually occur in nature. This view holds that while bootstrap loops may be logically consistent, and while certain solutions to Einstein's equations technically allow closed time-like curves, the conditions necessary to create such loops might be impossible to achieve in practice, or might be forbidden by laws of physics we don't yet fully understand. There are several reasons to be skeptical. One involves the conservation of energy and information. In ordinary physics, energy is conserved. It can change forms, but cannot be created or destroyed. Information, similarly, has a kind of conservation property in quantum mechanics, but a bootstrap loop seems to create information or energy in a strange way. The watch exists at multiple times without being created or destroyed. Does this violate conservation laws? The answer is not entirely clear, and this ambiguity suggests that bootstrap loops might trigger physical instabilities or be prevented by mechanisms we haven't fully identified. Another concern involves quantum mechanics. Stephen Hawking and others have argued that quantum effects might prevent the formation of closed time-like curves. When space-time is curved severely enough to allow time loops, quantum fluctuations might become so intense that they destroy the structure before it can close. Hawking called this the chronology protection conjecture. The laws of physics conspire to prevent time travel and thereby protect the consistency of history. If chronology is protected, then bootstrap loops cannot form, not because they're logically impossible, but because the physical conditions that would permit them are ruled out by quantum processes. There's also the issue of entropy. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that entropy, roughly speaking disorder or randomness, tends to increase over time. But in a perfectly repeating loop, entropy would have to be the same each time around. The watch returns to the same state cycle after cycle. How can this be reconciled with the tendency of disorder to increase? Some physicists argue that true closed loops might be incompatible with the thermodynamic arrow of time, the direction defined by increasing entropy. If so, bootstrap loops might be forbidden, not by logic, but by thermodynamics. These physical objections don't definitively rule out bootstrap loops, but they suggest caution. Even if closed time-like curves are solutions to Einstein's equations, even if they're logically consistent, they might represent configurations of spacetime that cannot actually occur in nature, either because quantum effects prevent them, or because they violate thermodynamic principles in subtle ways. The Bootstrap Paradox might be telling us something important. If a model of physics predicts origin-less causal loops too easily, without sufficient barriers or constraints, then that model might be missing important features of reality. This skeptical stance has the advantage of preserving our intuitions about origins and causality without requiring us to prohibit time travel entirely. It allows that time travel might be possible in some limited forms, perhaps travel to the future through time dilation, or perhaps very constrained forms of backward time travel, without permitting the full-blown paradoxes that arise from unrestricted, closed time-like curves. It's a middle ground. Time travel might exist, but the universe has guardrails that prevent the strangest outcomes. So where does all this leave us? We've explored the Bootstrap Paradox from multiple angles: the core structure of the loop, examples involving information and physical objects, comparisons with other paradoxes, and various responses ranging from acceptance to skepticism. What can we learn from this journey? The deepest lesson of the Bootstrap Paradox is that cause and origin are not the same thing. We tend to conflate them in everyday thinking because, in normal circumstances, they align. The cause of the book is the author writing it, and the author is also the origin, the source from which the book came into existence. But the Bootstrap Paradox forces us to separate these concepts. In a causal loop, every event has a cause. The loop is not random or arbitrary. Each step follows necessarily from the previous step. Causality is preserved. What's missing is the origin, the external point from which the loop emerged. This separation might seem like philosophical hair-splitting, but it's actually quite profound. It suggests that our demand for origins is not the same as our demand for causal explanations. You can have a complete causal story, every event explained by reference to earlier events, without having an origin story. The Bootstrap Paradox shows us a scenario where causality is local and circular, while origins, in the traditional sense, simply don't exist. This has implications beyond time travel puzzles. In cosmology, for instance, some models of the universe suggest eternal inflation or cyclical cosmologies where there is no single beginning, no first moment from which everything else emerged. The universe in these models is like a bootstrap loop writ large, self-sustaining, internally consistent, but lacking an ultimate origin point. The Bootstrap Paradox helps us understand how this could be coherent, even if it violates our intuitions. Similarly, in thinking about consciousness and self-reference, we encounter circular structures. Your sense of self is constructed from memories and experiences, but those memories and experiences are themselves shaped by your sense of self. The observer and the observed, the thinker and the thought form loops rather than clean hierarchies. The Bootstrap Paradox, by making us comfortable with circular causation, might help us think more clearly about these other domains where loops and self-reference appear. The paradox also teaches us something about explanation itself. We often assume that a good explanation traces back to something more fundamental, something prior, something that grounds everything else. This works well in many contexts. We explain the behaviour of matter by reference to atoms, atoms by reference to particles and forces and so on, drilling down to deeper levels. But the Bootstrap Paradox suggests that some explanations might be horizontal rather than vertical, circular rather than foundational. The explanation for why the watch is here is not that something more fundamental caused it, but that it's part of a self-consistent loop. The explanation is complete, but it doesn't ground out in anything external to the loop itself. This might make us uncomfortable, and that discomfort is worth examining. Why do we feel that explanations must terminate in foundations? Part of it is practical. In everyday life, causal chains do terminate. You trace the source of a river to a spring, the origin of a rumour to a person, the cause of a disease to a pathogen. Stopping at "it's a loop" would be unsatisfying in these contexts because it would mean giving up on finding a real external explanation. But the Bootstrap Paradox exists in contexts where time itself behaves differently, where the usual rules about before and after can be bent. In such contexts, perhaps our insistence on foundations is misplaced. There's also something aesthetically pleasing about foundations. We like the idea of building up from simple principles, of grounding complexity and simplicity, of tracing the intricate back to the elemental. Bootstrap loops, by contrast, are neither simple nor complex. They just are, existing as self-contained structures. They don't offer the satisfaction of reduction or the clarity of a base case. They're strange middle entities, too structured to be fundamental, too self-sustaining to need grounding in something else. The paradox doesn't demand that we accept bootstrap loops as real features of our universe. As we've seen, there are good physical reasons to be skeptical about whether closed time-like curves can actually form, and even better reasons to think that they would be extremely rare or limited if they did exist. But whether or not bootstrap loops are physically real, the paradox has value as a thought experiment. It shows us the logical structure of a certain kind of circular causation, and it challenges us to think clearly about what we mean by explanation, origin, and cause. In that sense, the bootstrap paradox is educational in the best way. It takes a concept we thought we understood, causality, and shows us that our understanding was incomplete. It reveals hidden assumptions we didn't know we were making. It forces us to distinguish between different aspects of causation that we normally lump together. And it does all this not by presenting us with a logical contradiction to solve, but by presenting us with a coherent scenario that nevertheless feels wrong, forcing us to interrogate why it feels wrong and whether that feeling is justified. Let's think a bit more carefully about what it would mean for a bootstrap loop to exist in practice, because there are subtleties we haven't fully explored yet. Suppose the loop is real. The watch genuinely cycles through time. The proofs genuinely circulate without an author. One question that arises is about the stability of the loop. Does the watch wear out as it cycles? Do small errors accumulate in the transmission of the proofs? In an idealized version of the paradox, we might imagine the loop as perfectly repeating, with each cycle identical to the last. The watch returns to exactly the same state each time. The proofs are transmitted without alteration or degradation. This perfect repetition would be necessary to maintain the loop indefinitely. If the watch degraded with each cycle, eventually it would deteriorate to the point where it couldn't function, and the loop would break. If errors crept into the proofs with each transmission, eventually they would become corrupted beyond recognition. But perfect repetition is difficult to achieve in the real world. Physical objects wear out, information degrades, entropy increases. So if a bootstrap loop is to be stable over many cycles, it would require either perfect preservation mechanisms, perhaps the loop passes through environments that restore the object to its original state, or the loop would have to be relatively short, covering only a span of time during which degradation is negligible. There's another subtlety involving the specificity of the loop. In our examples, we've talked about a particular watch or a particular set of proofs. But why those specific contents and not others? If the loop is self-contained, what determines what's in the loop? In ordinary causation, the specific outcome is determined by prior conditions and laws of nature. If you drop a ball, gravity determines how it falls. But in a bootstrap loop, there are no prior conditions external to the loop. The loop just is. So what picks out this particular watch, this particular set of proofs, rather than some other configuration? One response is that the loop must be self-consistent, and not all configurations would be. If the watch's design is too complex, it might not be possible for someone in the loop to preserve and transmit it accurately. If the proofs are wrong or incoherent, they wouldn't be publishable or credible. The requirement of self-consistency might constrain what loops are possible, ruling out many potential configurations and leaving only those that can sustain themselves. But this still leaves room for many possible loops, and it's not clear what would select among them. Perhaps if bootstrap loops are permitted by physics, there are many of them scattered through space-time each containing different objects or information. Or perhaps the formation of a loop requires such specific conditions that only certain configurations are achievable in practice, with the specifics determined by the details of how the loop forms, the exact curvature of space-time, the precise arrangement of matter and energy, and so on. This question of specificity connects to a deeper issue about the nature of physical law. We're accustomed to thinking of laws of nature as rules that, given initial conditions, determine how things evolve. The laws tell you what happens next given what's happening now, but in a bootstrap loop, there are no initial conditions external to the loop. The loop has no beginning where you could specify starting values. Does this mean the laws of nature are incomplete, unable to fully determine what happens in a universe with closed time-like curves? Or does it mean we need a different way of thinking about physical law, one that treats self-consistency as a constraint rather than evolution from initial conditions as the primary mode of determination? These are open questions, and they take us to the frontiers of theoretical physics and philosophy. Some researchers working on quantum gravity and the nature of time have proposed that the universe might be best described not by evolution from an initial state, but by a kind of global self-consistency condition. The universe is the way it is because that's a self-consistent configuration, and other configurations would contradict themselves in various ways. This view is speculative, but it gains some motivation from the Bootstrap Paradox and related puzzles about time and causation. Another aspect worth considering is the subjective experience of someone inside a bootstrap loop. Imagine you are the time traveller who brings the book of proofs back to the mathematician. From your perspective, you study the proofs, learn them, decide to bring them back. Your actions are motivated by your knowledge and desires. You feel like you're making free choices, but the entire sequence of your actions is part of a loop that has no external cause. Were your choices really free, or were they determined by the structure of the loop itself? This is a version of the free will problem, but with an extra twist. In ordinary determinism, your actions are determined by prior states of the universe, which in turn were determined by earlier states, possibly tracing back to initial conditions at the Big Bang or some other starting point. You might not have libertarian free will, the ability to have done otherwise, but at least there's a sense in which the chain of causation grounds out in something external to you. In a bootstrap loop, the chain of causation includes you and loops back through you. You are part of what determines yourself. This is a strange kind of self-determination, but it's not clear whether it counts as freedom or simply a more elaborate form of constraint. Some philosophers find this appealing, actually. If you're part of a self-consistent loop, then in a sense you participate in determining your own actions, not by stepping outside the causal order, but by being an essential part of the causal structure. Your choices contribute to the overall consistency of the loop. Of course, this participation is not the same as having the power to do otherwise. If the loop is self-consistent, then it must unfold the way it does, but it blurs the line between determined and self-determined in interesting ways. Others find this deeply unsettling because it seems to collapse the distinction between agent and mechanism. If your actions are part of a predetermined loop, then in what sense are they yours? You're not choosing based on reasons external to the loop. You're simply a component in a causal structure that includes you. Your sense of deliberation and decision-making might be a kind of illusion, or at least a local phenomenon that doesn't reflect the global structure of the loop. These questions about free will and agency in bootstrap loops connect to broader debates about determinism and responsibility, but they have a unique flavour because of the circular structure. They're not just about whether your actions are determined by prior states, but about whether your actions are part of a self-contained causal circuit that includes you as one of the relays. Let's return to the question of physical plausibility. We've mentioned that quantum effects might prevent the formation of closed time-like curves, But let's dig a bit deeper into why this might be the case. The concern is that, as space-time curves more and more severely, approaching the configuration needed for a time loop, quantum fluctuations of the fields pervading space would become increasingly intense. Normally, these fluctuations are tiny and average out to near zero, but in highly curved space-time, they can be amplified. In particular, near the point where a time loop would close, you might expect a phenomenon called a quantum vacuum fluctuation to blow up. Virtual particles, which normally pop in and out of existence on tiny scales, might be produced in such numbers that they create a huge back reaction, warping spacetime in the opposite direction and preventing the loop from forming. This is the basis of the chronology protection conjecture. Quantum effects act as a kind of immune response, attacking any configuration of spacetime that threatens to allow travel to the past. The mathematics of this is complex and not fully understood. Calculating quantum effects in curved spacetime is one of the hardest problems in theoretical physics, and we don't yet have a complete theory of quantum gravity that would let us answer definitively what happens near closed time-like curves. But the heuristic argument that quantum fluctuations would destabilize the loop is taken seriously by many physicists as a reason to think that time travel to the past, and therefore bootstrap loops, might be impossible in practice, even if they're not forbidden by classical general relativity. On the other hand, some researchers have explored whether there might be exotic forms of matter or energy that could stabilize a time loop against quantum disruption. These would be materials with strange properties like negative energy density or violations of energy conditions that normally hold. Such exotic matter has not been observed in nature, and it's not clear whether it can exist, but it's not definitively ruled out either. If it does exist, it might make closed time-like curves more stable, potentially allowing bootstrap loops to form. The hunt for exotic matter and the study of quantum effects in curved spacetime are both active areas of research, motivated in part by the puzzles raised by time travel scenarios like the Bootstrap Paradox. Even if we conclude that bootstrap loops are impossible in our universe, understanding why they're impossible would teach us something important about the deep structure of physics. There's also a question about what kinds of time loops might be possible, even if full-fledged closed time-like curves are not. For instance, quantum mechanics allows for a phenomenon called retrocausality, where the outcome of a measurement can be influenced by events in its future. This doesn't permit classical time travel. You can't send a watch or a book backward, but it does involve causal influence flowing in both temporal directions. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics embrace retrocausality as a fundamental feature, while others reject it in favour of purely forward-moving causation. If retrocausality is real at the quantum level, then in some sense causal loops already exist in nature, just not at the macroscopic scale where we could exploit them for time travel. A measurement here and now might be causally connected to a choice made in the future, forming a small, localized loop in the web of causation. These quantum loops wouldn't allow you to send information backward in time in a controlled way, but they would mean that the universe already contains structures reminiscent of the Bootstrap Paradox. This is speculative, and many physicists are skeptical of retrocausal interpretations of quantum mechanics. But the point is that the Bootstrap Paradox, while often discussed in the context of macroscopic time travel, connects to deeper questions about the nature of causation and time that appear in fundamental physics. The paradox is not just a curiosity about time machines, it's a probe into the structure of causality itself. Let's consider one more variation of the paradox, one that brings out a slightly different flavour of the puzzle. Suppose instead of a watch or a book, we're talking about a piece of genetic information. Imagine a time traveller who carries a DNA sample backward in time. This sample is incorporated into a genome, perhaps through advanced genetic engineering, and the organism that develops from this genome eventually gives rise to descendants, one of whom becomes the time traveller who carries the DNA sample backward. Now the question is, where did that specific sequence of DNA come from? It's not the result of evolution in the usual sense, because evolution involves variation and selection over many generations, and those processes would generate new sequences. But in the loop, the sequence is transmitted unchanged from future to past and back. It exists without having been generated by evolutionary processes. It's a genetic bootstrap. This variation highlights something interesting. Information, whether in the form of mathematical proofs, DNA sequences, or any other encoding, seems particularly suited to bootstrap loops because it can be copied with high fidelity. A physical object might degrade over time, but information, if properly copied, can remain unchanged. Of course, in reality, copying is never perfect. There are always small errors, mutations, transcription mistakes. But in principle, information is the kind of thing that can circulate through a loop without degradation. This raises the question of whether bootstrap loops are more plausible for information than for physical objects. If so, then maybe the Bootstrap Paradox is primarily a problem about the origin of information rather than the origin of matter. Information can exist in a loop, while matter, subject to wear and entropy, cannot sustain perfect loops. Of course, information is always encoded in matter, whether in ink on paper, neurons in a brain, or bases in a DNA strand. But perhaps the relevant feature is the information itself, not the physical substrate. This connects to debates in philosophy of mind and information theory about whether information is a fundamental feature of reality or merely a useful abstraction. If information is fundamental, then maybe bootstrap loops of information are not just logically possible, but physically permissible. If information is merely a way of describing physical states, then the constraints on physical loops would also constrain informational loops. We should also consider the narrative and dramatic uses of the Bootstrap Paradox, because while our focus is on the science and philosophy, the paradox has captured the imagination of storytellers for good reason. It's a device that allows for elegant, self-contained plots, where every element is explained, but the overall structure has a kind of mysterious completeness. A character receives a message from the future, acts on it, and in doing so causes the message to be sent. Everything makes sense, but nothing had to start. In fiction, this can create a sense of fate or inevitability. The characters are playing out roles in a script that has no author, following a pattern that exists simply because it's self-consistent. This can be thrilling or eerie, depending on how it's framed. But it's worth noting that the narrative appeal of the Bootstrap Paradox is not separate from its philosophical interest. Both stem from the same source, the tension between our desire for origins and the coherence of the loop. Science fiction has explored many variations. In some stories, the loop is tight and simple, a single object or piece of information cycling through time. In others, the loop is vast and complex, involving entire civilizations or histories that curve back on themselves. Some stories treat the loop as stable and eternal. Others explore what happens if the loop is disrupted or decays over time. These narrative explorations can serve as intuition pumps, helping us think through the implications and variations of the paradox in ways that pure abstraction might not. But we should be careful not to let the narrative convenience of bootstrap loops in fiction make us overestimate their plausibility in reality. Fiction operates under different constraints than physics. A story needs to be coherent and satisfying. A physical theory needs to be consistent with observation and experiment. The Bootstrap Paradox is a wonderful narrative device, but that doesn't make it a feature of our universe. At the same time, fiction can sometimes point toward conceptual possibilities that are worth taking seriously. Many concepts in modern physics, higher dimensions, parallel universes, black holes, were once purely speculative or appeared first in fiction before being developed rigorously by scientists. The Bootstrap Paradox might be similar, a thought experiment that clarifies the logical structure of time and causation, even if it never describes an actual event. As we near the end of this exploration, it's worth stepping back and asking what we've gained from all this. The Bootstrap Paradox doesn't have a clean resolution. It's not like a math problem where you can turn to the back of the book and check the answer. Different responses, self-consistency, branching timelines, physical prohibition, all have their merits and drawbacks. The paradox remains genuinely puzzling, and that's part of its value. What we've gained is a richer understanding of causation. We've learned to distinguish between local and global causal structure, between having causes for individual events and having an origin for a system as a whole. We've seen that circular causation is logically coherent, even if it's strange and unfamiliar. We've explored how physics might or might not permit such structures, and we've thought about what it would mean for explanation and understanding if they did occur. The Bootstrap Paradox also serves as a reminder of how much we assume when we think about the world. We assume that time flows in one direction, that causes precede effects, that everything has a beginning. These assumptions are so basic that we rarely notice them. But they're not self-evident truths. They're features of the world as we experience it. And in principle, a world with different features, a world with closed time-like curves, might be possible. The paradox helps us see our assumptions by showing us what a world without them would look like. There's also a kind of humility that comes from engaging with the Bootstrap Paradox. It reminds us that even basic concepts like cause and origin, which seem so clear and straightforward, can become slippery and complex when we push them into unusual contexts. This doesn't mean those concepts are useless or that we should abandon them. It means they have limits, boundaries beyond which they stop giving us reliable guidance. Recognizing those limits is part of thinking clearly. In the end, the Bootstrap Paradox is a puzzle about existence and explanation. It asks whether something can exist without being created, whether a chain of causes can form a circle, whether explanations must always ground out in foundations or can sometimes be self-supporting loops. These are deep questions, and the paradox doesn't answer them so much as make them vivid and concrete. Perhaps the best way to think about the Bootstrap Paradox is as a kind of lens. It doesn't change the world, but it changes how we see the world. It brings into focus the structure of causation, the nature of time, the meaning of explanation, and by showing us a scenario where all these familiar concepts behave in unfamiliar ways, it helps us understand them better. We started with the assumption that everything has a beginning, and we've journeyed through a landscape where that assumption breaks down. We've seen how an object or piece of information could exist without ever being created, how a loop could be self-sustaining and complete yet strangely unfinished. We've explored responses, considered physical possibilities, and thought about what it all means. The Bootstrap Paradox doesn't demand a final answer. It's not a puzzle to be solved and discarded. It's a conceptual tool, a thought experiment that helps us explore the edges of what we understand about time and causation. Whether or not bootstrap loops are real, whether or not time travel is possible, the paradox has done its work. It's challenged us to think more carefully, to question our assumptions, and to appreciate the subtlety of concepts we normally take for granted. As we let these ideas settle, we can appreciate the paradox for what it is, a window into the strange possibilities that open up when time is treated not as a simple, one-directional flow, but as a dimension that might, under the right conditions, curve back on itself. It's a reminder that the universe, even in its logical structure, holds mysteries and surprises. And it's an invitation to keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep exploring the boundaries of what we know and what we can imagine. The Bootstrap Paradox shows us that cause and origin can come apart, that something can be fully explained step by step and still lack a first step, that loops can be complete and coherent and still leave us searching for a beginning that isn't there. It's a gentle paradox, not a contradiction, but an oddity, a structure that fits together perfectly, while missing the piece we most want to find. And in that peculiar completeness, that origin-less existence, we find something to ponder as we drift towards sleep. A puzzle that asks not for an answer, but for contemplation. A loop of thought that circles back on itself, complete and self-contained. Just like the paradox it describes. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The world we move through, from morning to night, runs on a rhythm so familiar that we rarely notice it. One thing leads to another. Earlier moments shape later ones, and the past sits fixed behind us, while the future remains open ahead. When you flip a light switch, the bulb glows. When you drop a cup, it falls. Cause flows into effect with a steadiness that feels almost like a physical law, and in a sense, it is. This chain of causality gives structure to our days, our decisions, and our understanding of how events connect. We live in a universe where time moves forward, where what has already happened cannot be undone, and where the sequence of events follows a logic that makes sense. But then comes a question, simple on the surface, that threatens to unravel that entire structure. What if you could travel backward in time and change something that made your journey possible in the first place? Not a grand change, not the reshaping of empires or the prevention of disasters, but something deeply personal, something that reaches into your own origin and pulls it apart. The grandfather paradox is built on exactly this question. It doesn't ask you to imagine complex machinery or exotic physics. It only asks you to consider one trip backward, one act and one consequence. The paradox gets its name from the simplest version of the problem. A traveller goes back in time to a moment before their grandparents ever meet and prevents that meeting from happening. If the grandparents never meet, they never have children. If they never have children, the traveller is never born. And if the traveller is never born, they cannot make the trip back to prevent the meeting. The circle closes on itself, and the logic collapses into contradiction. This is not a story about adventure or tragedy. It is a thought experiment, a tool for examining the deepest assumptions we make about time, causality, and the structure of events. The grandfather paradox asks whether the universe can allow backward time travel without breaking the rules that keep history coherent. And in asking that question, it forces us to think carefully about what we mean when we say the past is fixed, what we mean when we imagine changing it, and whether the idea of changing your own origin even makes sense in a world governed by consistent cause and effect. The paradox is clean, sharp, and unsettling, not because it involves dramatic consequences, but because it reveals a quiet, fundamental tension in the logic of time. Let's begin by setting up the scenario with care, because the paradox depends on understanding exactly what is being proposed. Imagine a person who exists in the present day, someone with a history, a lineage, a chain of ancestors stretching backward through time. Among those ancestors are two people, the traveller's grandparents, who at some point in the past met, formed a relationship, and eventually had a child who became the traveller's parent. This meeting, unremarkable in itself, was a necessary link in the chain that led to the traveller's existence. Without that meeting, the traveller's parent would not exist. Without the parent, the traveller would not exist. The meeting is a causal dependency, a moment on which later moments depend. Now imagine that this traveller gains access to some mechanism for travelling backward in time. The details of that mechanism are not important for the paradox. It could be a machine, a natural phenomenon, a fold in space-time, or simply a hypothetical granted for the sake of argument. The key point is that the traveller moves from the present to a time in the past, specifically to a time before their grandparents have met. Once there, the traveller has the opportunity to act. And in the scenario that defines the paradox, the traveller chooses to act in a way that prevents the meeting from happening. Perhaps the traveller warns one grandparent away from a location, or introduces a distraction, or simply ensures that the two never cross paths. The method is not important. What matters is the outcome. The meeting does not occur. If the meeting does not occur, then the chain of events that led to the traveller's birth is broken. The traveller's parent is never born, and therefore the traveller is never born. At this point, the paradox begins to assert itself. The traveller's existence depended on the meeting. If the meeting is prevented, the traveller cannot exist. But if the traveller does not exist, they cannot have travelled back in time to prevent the meeting. And if they did not prevent the meeting, then the meeting happens, the traveller's parent is born, and the traveller is born, which means they can travel back and prevent the meeting. The loop is complete, and it contains a contradiction that refuses to resolve. This is not a question of probability or chance. It is not a matter of saying, well, maybe the traveller would fail, or perhaps something would stop them. The paradox is built on the assumption that the traveller succeeds, that the prevention is real, and that the causal chain is broken. And yet that success requires the traveller to exist, which requires the chain to remain unbroken. The paradox is a direct logical collision, a situation where two incompatible histories seem to be demanded by the same sequence of events. Either the meeting happens, or it doesn't. Either the traveller exists, or they don't. But the scenario seems to require both outcomes at once, depending on which moment in the timeline you examine. This is why the grandfather paradox is so much more than a quirky story problem. It exposes a structural tension in the idea of backward time travel. When we imagine travelling forward in time, we are simply imagining skipping ahead, moving through the future faster than normal. There is no contradiction in that. The future has not happened yet, so there is no fixed sequence of events to violate. But when we imagine travelling backward, we are entering a domain that has already happened, a stretch of history that is settled and complete. And if we imagine changing that history, we are proposing to alter events that led to the present moment, including, potentially, the events that led to our own existence. The paradox asks whether that kind of change is even possible in a universe governed by consistent cause and effect. Let's slow down and examine the contradiction in more detail, because the paradox is subtle and it deserves careful attention. The traveller exists in the present. That existence is a fact, a result of a long chain of causes stretching back through time. Among those causes is the meeting of the traveller's grandparents. The meeting is not optional, it is a necessary condition for the traveller's existence. If the meeting did not happen, the traveller would not exist. This is straightforward causality, the kind we rely on every day. Now the traveller goes back in time. At the moment of travel, they exist. They have a body, a mind, a history. They step into the past and they are there, physically present, able to act. They find the time and place where the grandparents are about to meet, and they intervene. The intervention succeeds. The grandparents do not meet. At this point, the chain of causality that led to the traveller's existence is broken at its source. The traveller's parent is never born. The traveller is never born. But here is the problem. If the traveller is never born, they cannot be standing in the past, intervening. The action that broke the chain depends on the traveller existing, which depends on the chain remaining unbroken. This is not a matter of the traveller fading away like a character in a science fiction story. The paradox is not about what happens to the traveller's body or their memory. It is about the logical structure of events. If the traveller exists, then the chain must be intact, which means the meeting happened, which means the intervention did not succeed. But if the intervention did not succeed, then the traveller can travel back and try again. And if they try again, they might succeed, which means the chain is broken, which means they do not exist, which means they cannot intervene. The timeline seems to demand two histories at once, one in which the meeting happens and the traveller exists, and one in which the meeting does not happen and the traveller does not exist. But a single, consistent timeline cannot contain both histories. This is the heart of the paradox. It is not a puzzle to be solved by cleverness or imagination. It is a logical impossibility, a situation where the conditions of the scenario contradict each other. The paradox reveals that backward time travel, if it allows for changes to the past, threatens the consistency of history. And consistency is not a small matter. Consistency is what allows us to make sense of events, to trace causes to effects, to understand why things happen. If history can be both one way and another way at the same time, then causality breaks down, and with it, our ability to reason about the world. So the grandfather paradox is not just a fun thought experiment. It is a test, a challenge to any theory or idea that permits backward time travel. The test is simple. Can your theory allow travel to the past while preserving a coherent, consistent timeline? If it cannot, then something must give. Either time travel must be restricted in some way, or the idea of a single, consistent history must be abandoned, or time travel must be ruled out entirely. These are the three main responses to the paradox, and each response has profound implications for how we understand time causality and the nature of the universe. The first response is to insist that the past is fixed, that history is self-consistent, and that any attempt to create a contradiction will fail. This is sometimes called the self-consistency principle, and it has a long history in discussions of time travel. The core idea is simple. If time travel is possible, then the past already includes all the actions of time travelers, and those actions must be consistent with the history that led to the traveler's existence. In other words, you cannot change the past because the past already happened, and it happened in a way that allowed you to exist and to travel back. Any attempt to prevent your grandparents from meeting would fail, not by chance, but because a consistent timeline has no room for a successful contradiction. Under this view, the grandfather paradox is not a paradox at all. It is simply a demonstration that certain actions are impossible. You might go back in time with the intention of preventing the meeting, but something would always stop you. Perhaps you would arrive too late, or be delayed by unforeseen circumstances, or find that the grandparents met in a different way than you expected. Perhaps you would change your mind, or be unable to act, or discover that your intervention was part of the reason they met in the first place. The universe, in effect, protects its own consistency. It does not allow events to unfold in a way that would create contradictions. This might sound like fate or predestination, but it is not quite that. It is not that your actions are forced or that you lack free will. It is that the space of possible actions is constrained by the requirement of consistency. You cannot perform an action that would erase your own existence because such an action would be logically impossible. It is similar to saying you cannot draw a square circle or create a married bachelor. The impossibility is not physical, it is logical, and in a universe governed by consistent cause and effect, logical impossibilities do not happen. This approach has a certain elegance. It allows time travel to exist while preserving the coherence of history. But it also raises questions. If the past is fixed, then what does it mean to travel back in time and act? Are you truly free to choose your actions, or are you simply playing out a role that history has already assigned to you? And if every action you take in the past was already part of history, then in what sense are you changing anything? You are not changing the past, you are simply being part of it. The past already included your visit, your actions, your presence. Nothing new is happening. You are just experiencing events that, from the perspective of the timeline, already occurred. Some people find this satisfying, others find it troubling. It seems to reduce time travel to a kind of observation, where the traveller is a participant in history, but not an agent who can alter it. The past is a script that has already been written, and the traveller is an actor who must follow the lines. There is no room for improvisation, no possibility of deviation. The timeline is a single, fixed structure, and time travel is simply a way of moving within that structure, not a way of changing it. But there is another response to the paradox, one that takes a very different approach. Instead of insisting that the past is fixed, this response suggests that travelling back in time does not take you to your past, but rather to a different timeline, a branching history that diverges from the one you came from. Under this view, when the traveller goes back and prevents the grandparents from meeting, they are not erasing their own history. They are creating or entering a new history, a branch where the meeting does not occur, where the traveller's parent is never born, and where the traveller never exists in that branch. But the traveller themselves does not vanish, because they originated from the original timeline, not the new one. They are a visitor from a different branch of history, and their existence is grounded in that original branch, not in the altered one. This is the branching timelines approach, sometimes called the many worlds interpretation of time travel. It dissolves the paradox by separating the traveller's origin history from the history they alter. There is no contradiction because there are two distinct histories, and they do not interfere with each other. In the original timeline, the grandparents meet, the traveller is born, and the traveller eventually travels back. In the new branch, the grandparents do not meet, and the traveller's counterpart is never born. The traveller stands in the new branch as a remnant of the original, a being whose existence makes sense only in the context of a different history. This approach has its own appeal. It allows for genuine changes to the past, or at least to a version of the past, without creating contradictions. The traveller is free to act, to intervene, to alter events, because those alterations do not erase the traveller's own origin. The timeline does not loop back on itself. It forks, creating a new path that diverges from the old. And because the two paths are separate, there is no logical collision, no demand for two incompatible histories within a single timeline. But the branching approach comes with its own costs. It requires accepting the existence of multiple timelines, multiple versions of history that coexist in some way. This raises questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between these branches, and the meaning of identity. If the traveller prevents the meeting in one branch, are they saving the people in that branch from some future consequence? Or are they simply creating a new world where those consequences do not occur? And what about the original timeline? Does it still exist, unchanged, with the grandparents meeting and the traveller eventually being born, while the new branch unfolds in parallel? If so, then the traveller has not changed their own past. They have simply created a different past for a different world. Some people find this satisfying because it allows for agency and change without contradiction. Others find it unsatisfying because it seems to dilute the significance of time. Travel. If you cannot change your own past, only create new branches, then time travel is not really about revisiting and altering your history. It is about generating alternate histories, parallel worlds that diverge from your origin. The traveller becomes a kind of immigrant, moving from one world to another, but never able to return to the exact moment and place they came from, at least not in a way that would allow them to change it. And then there is the third response, the hardest and the simplest. Perhaps backward time travel is simply impossible. Perhaps the universe does not allow it, not because of technological limitations or practical difficulties, but because the very idea contains a logical flaw that cannot be resolved. The grandfather paradox, under this view, is not a puzzle to be solved. It is evidence, a demonstration that any physical theory permitting backward time travel in a single, consistent timeline must be wrong or incomplete. The paradox functions as a paradox. Warning sign. If your theory leads to this kind of contradiction, something in the theory must be adjusted or rejected. This view is sometimes called the causality protection conjecture, or more informally, the idea that the universe protects its own consistency by forbidding processes that would violate it. If time travel to the past were possible, and if it allowed for changes that could erase their own causes, then the universe would be vulnerable to contradictions. And since contradictions cannot occur in a consistent physical reality, the universe must prevent the conditions that would create them. Backward time travel at least of the kind that allows causal loops and self-negating actions, is ruled out by the structure of space-time itself. This is a conservative response, but it has a certain appeal. It preserves the integrity of causality without requiring multiple timelines or self-consistency constraints that feel like fate. It simply says, the universe is the way it is, and part of being the way it is involves not allowing backward travel that would create paradoxes. Time is directional, flowing from past to future, and that flow is a fundamental feature of reality, not something that can be reversed or circumvented. Of course, this response does not answer the question of why time is directional, or what physical mechanism enforces the prohibition on backward travel. It is more of a boundary condition, a statement of what is possible rather than an explanation of what prevents the impossible. But it has the virtue of simplicity. It does not require exotic structures or ontologies. It simply says, time travel to the past is not part of the universe we live in, and the grandfather paradox is one reason we can be confident of that. So we have three responses, three ways of addressing the paradox. The self-consistency approach says the past is fixed and time travel cannot create contradictions, so any attempt to prevent the meeting would fail. The branching approach says time travel creates new timelines, so the contradiction dissolves because the traveller's origin is separate from the altered history. And the impossibility approach says backward time travel cannot happen, so the paradox is a reductio ad absurdum, a proof by contradiction that the scenario is not physically realizable. Each response preserves logical consistency, but each does so in a different way, and each has different implications for how we understand time, causality, and the nature of reality. But the grandfather paradox is not just about resolving contradictions or defending theories. It also teaches us something deeper, something about identity, agency, and the meaning of could have. When we imagine time travel, we often imagine a kind of freedom, the ability to go back and fix mistakes, to undo regrets, to change the course of events. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of that freedom. If changing the past means erasing the reason you went back, then the very idea of that change becomes logically incoherent. You cannot exercise agency in a way that deletes the conditions of your own existence, because such an exercise would be self-negating. This is a profound limit, and it touches on questions that go beyond physics. What does it mean to say, I could have done otherwise, if doing otherwise would eliminate the I who did it? In ordinary life, we assume a kind of continuity. I am the same person who made a choice yesterday, and I can reflect on that choice, regret it, wish I had chosen differently. But time travel breaks that continuity in a unique way. If I go back and change the choice, I do not simply create a different present for myself. I potentially erase the entire chain of events that made me the person who is capable of going back. The paradox reveals that causality and identity are intertwined, that I am a product of a history, and that history must remain consistent for I to exist. This is not to say that we lack free will, or that our choices are not real. It is to say that free will operates within a framework of causality, and that framework has constraints. You can make choices, and those choices have consequences, but you cannot make a choice that eliminates the conditions under which you're able to make choices. The grandfather paradox is an extreme illustration of this point. It asks what happens when you try to exercise agency in a way that undermines the basis of your own agency, and the answer is logical contradiction. The universe does not allow it, either because the action would fail, or because the action would create a new branch, or because the action is impossible from the start. There is also a kind of emotional intuition at work when we think about time travel, a feeling that if we could just go back, we could fix things, make them right, undo the harm. The grandfather paradox challenges that intuition by showing that the logic of causality does not bend to our desires. The past is not a rough draft that can be revised. It is a foundation on which the present stands, and pulling out a foundational stone means the whole structure collapses, including the person doing the pulling. This is not a pessimistic conclusion. It is simply a recognition of how cause and effect work. The past shapes us, and we cannot unshape ourselves by changing that past, because the change would eliminate the shaped person who made it. In this way, the paradox teaches a kind of humility. It reminds us that we are embedded in time, that our existence is contingent on a vast web of prior events, and that we cannot step outside that web without losing the ground beneath our feet. Time travel stories often imagine a hero who stands outside time, who can manipulate it freely, who is immune to the consequences of changing history. But the grandfather paradox says, no, you cannot stand outside. You are part of the timeline. Your existence depends on it. And if you try to change it in a way that erases you, the change itself becomes impossible. This is a lesson not just about time travel, but about the structure of reality. Causality is not just a rule. It is the fabric that holds events together, that gives meaning to before and after, that allows us to say, this happened because that happened. When we think about time, we often think of it as a river, flowing from past to future, carrying events along with it. The grandfather paradox asks, what happens if you try to swim upstream and cut off the source? The answer is that you cannot, because you're made of the water that flows from that source. Remove the source, and you remove yourself, and the removal undoes itself. The river flows on, unchanged, because it cannot be interrupted by something that depends on it for existence. Let's return to the core question one more time, because it is worth holding in mind. If you could alter the past, could you ever alter it in a way that deletes the reason you went back? The paradox says no, not in a single consistent timeline. Either the alteration fails, or it creates a new branch, or it never happens at all. And this is not a failure of imagination or a limit of storytelling. It is a fundamental constraint imposed by the logic of causality. The past and the present are linked, not by sentiment or memory, but by the unyielding requirement that effects must follow from causes, and that a cause cannot be undone by its own effect. The grandfather paradox is a simple thought experiment, but it carries a deep purpose. It shows how fragile causality becomes when you allow effects to reach backward into their own causes. It reveals the tension between our intuitive sense of what time travel should allow and the logical requirements of a consistent universe. And it forces anyone who thinks seriously about time travel to answer, not with drama or speculation, but with clear rules. How the timeline stays coherent when the past can be visited. In the Wachi end, the paradox is less about time machines or adventures through history and more about the nature of time itself. It asks whether time is a dimension that can be navigated freely, like space, or whether it has a unique structure, a directionality, a resistance to being undone. And it suggests that whatever the answer must respect the fact that we are beings embedded in time, shaped by it, and unable to escape the logic that connects our existence to the events that came before. The paradox does not have a single resolution that everyone agrees on. Different thinkers, different theories, different philosophical perspectives offer different answers. But the question remains, and it remains because it touches on something fundamental about how the universe works, or at least how it seems to work from our perspective as creatures who move through time in one direction, from birth to death, from cause to effect, from past to future. The grandfather paradox is a reminder that time is not just a stage on which events unfold, it is part of the structure of those events, and changing it is not as simple as turning a dial or stepping through a door. And so we return to the calm takeaway, the gentle landing after all this thinking. The grandfather paradox is not a crisis. It is not a horror. It is a tool, a way of clarifying what we mean when we talk about time, causality, and change. It shows us that the past is not infinitely malleable, that our existence is tied to a history that cannot be casually erased, and that any serious idea of time travel must grapple with the logic of consistency. The paradox asks a question, and the question is worth asking because it leads us to think more carefully about the world we live in, the time we move through, and the causes and effects that connect one moment to the next. Time flows, the past recedes, the future approaches, and we move along with it, unable to turn back, unable to erase what has been. The grandfather paradox is a thought experiment that reminds us of that fact, not with sadness or regret, but with a quiet recognition of the structure that holds everything together. Causality is real, time is directional, and the logic that binds them is not negotiable. And in that non-negotiable logic, there is a kind of stability, a foundation we can rely on, even if it means we cannot undo the past. The universe, it seems, has its rules, and one of those rules, whether enforced by self-consistency, by branching timelines, or by the impossibility of backward travel, is that you cannot erase yourself by changing the events that led to your existence. The paradox is a demonstration of that rule, a sharp, clear illustration of what happens when you try. And the answer is always the same. The timeline stays coherent, one way or another, because coherence is not optional. It is the very basis of a world where events make sense, where history is knowable, and where we can trace the thread of cause and effect from one moment to the next. The grandfather paradox stands as a quiet sentinel at the boundary between logic and imagination, between what we can dream of and what the structure of reality permits. It does not close the door on time travel entirely, but it does insist that any door that opens must lead to a hallway that does not loop back into itself in a way that erases the person walking through it. The hallway must be consistent, must follow rules, must preserve the connection between the walker and the walk. And in that insistence, there is a kind of comfort. The universe is not arbitrary. It does not allow contradictions. It holds itself together with a logic that is stern but fair, unyielding but comprehensible. The grandfather paradox is a test of that logic, and the logic passes every time by refusing to permit the impossible. Time travel, if it exists, must bow to consistency. And if it cannot, then it does not exist, and we remain here in the present, shaped by the past moving toward the future, one moment at a time, in a timeline that makes sense. This is the lesson of the paradox, the quiet, steady conclusion that emerges from all the thought and all the questions. The past is what it is. The present follows from it. The future will follow from the present. And you, the person thinking about all this, are a link in that chain, a being whose existence testifies to the fact that the chain has held, that the causes and effects have lined up, that history has unfolded in a way that brought you here. The paradox asks whether you could break that chain by travelling back and interfering with it. And the answer is no, not in a way that makes you disappear, because your disappearance would erase the interference and the chain would remain unbroken. There is a beauty in that answer, a kind of integrity. The universe protects its own consistency, not by force or by accident, but by the very structure of causality. And we, as beings who live within that structure, can trust it, can rely on it, can know that the past is fixed in a way that gives meaning to the present. The grandfather paradox is a thought experiment that reveals that trust, that reliance, that meaning. It shows us that time is not just a dimension to be navigated, but a framework to be respected, a logic to be honoured, and a foundation on which everything else is built. And so, as you think about the paradox, as you turn it over in your mind, as you consider the traveller and the grandparents, and the meeting that must or must not happen, You are also thinking about yourself, your own history, your own place in the chain of cause and effect. You are realizing that you're not separate from time, not an observer standing outside it, but a participant, a product, a result. Your existence is proof that the timeline is consistent, that the cause is lined up, that the effects followed. And that proof is all around you, in every memory, every choice, every moment that led to this one. The grandfather paradox is not a threat, it is a clarification. It is a way of seeing the structure of time more clearly, of understanding the limits and the possibilities, of recognizing that some things are not negotiable, not because they are forbidden by fiat, but because they are incoherent by definition. You cannot erase yourself by changing the past because the change depends on you, and you depend on the past. The circle is closed, the logic is complete, and the timeline stands consistent and whole. And in that wholeness, there is peace. The past is behind you, fixed and complete. The future is ahead, open and uncertain. And you are here in the present, the product of one and the creator of the other, moving through time in the only way that makes sense, forward, steadily, one moment at a time, in a universe that holds itself together with a logic that cannot be broken, no matter how much we might imagine otherwise. The grandfather paradox is a reminder of that. Logic, a gentle, insistent reminder that causality is real, that time has a direction, and that the structure of the universe is such that you cannot step outside it without ceasing to be. And in that reminder, there is a kind of reassurance, a knowledge that the world makes sense, that the past is stable, that the present is grounded, and that the future, whatever it holds, will follow from the same chain of cause and effect that brought you here. So the paradox, in the end, is not about impossibility or frustration or limitation. It is about understanding. It is about seeing the world as it is, with its rules and its logic and its quiet, unyielding structure. And it is about accepting that we are part of that world, bound by its rules, shaped by its logic, and held in place by its structure. The grandfather paradox is a window into that understanding, a thought experiment that teaches us, with patience and clarity, how the universe works, how time flows, and how causality binds everything together into a coherent, consistent whole. And as you drift towards sleep, as the thoughts settle and the questions fade, you can rest in that understanding, knowing that the world is stable, that the past is fixed, that the present is real, and that the future will unfold in a way that makes sense, one moment leading to the next, in a chain that cannot be broken, in a timeline that holds. The grandfather paradox asks a question, and the answer is the same as the answer to so many questions about the universe. Consistency, coherence, logic. The universe holds itself together, and in that holding, there is order, there is meaning, and there is a foundation we can trust. The paradox is a thought experiment, but it is also a kind of meditation, a way of thinking about time that brings clarity and calm. It shows us that the world is not chaotic, not arbitrary, not vulnerable to contradictions. It shows us that causality is real, that time is directional, and that the structure of events is such that the past supports the present, and the present will support the future, in a chain that cannot be undone, in a logic that cannot be violated, in a universe that makes sense. And so, with that calm understanding, we let the paradox settle, let the questions rest, and let the quiet logic of causality carry us forward, into sleep, into dreams, into the next moment, knowing that the timeline is consistent, the universe is coherent, and the past, whatever it was, is fixed in a way that allows the present to be what it is, and the future to unfold as it will. The grandfather paradox is a reminder, a teacher, a guide, and in its simplicity, it reveals the deep, steady structure of time itself, the structure that holds everything together, the structure that makes sense, the structure that allows us to move through the world with confidence. knowing that cause leads to effect, that before leads to after, and that the universe, in its quiet way, holds itself together, moment by moment, in a chain that cannot be broken. Before we descend into the darkness, I want to ask a favour. If you enjoy this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference. And if you'd like, comment what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. Now let's begin. There is something quietly comfortable about the assumption that things stay themselves. The ship docked at the harbour this morning is the same ship that was there yesterday. The chair in the corner of the room is the same chair it was last week. We live surrounded by objects that seem to maintain their identities despite the passage of time, despite minor wear and tear, despite small repairs and adjustments. This sense of stable identity feels so natural that we rarely question it. A ship might get a fresh coat of paint, a new sail, a replaced board or two, and we still call it by the same name, still think of it as the same vessel. The continuity seems obvious, unproblematic, woven into the basic fabric of how we navigate the world. But there is an ancient thought experiment that takes this everyday comfort and stretches it until something strange begins to show through. It does not do this through dramatic transformation or sudden change. Instead, it simply follows the normal process of maintenance and repair to its logical conclusion, and in doing so, reveals a quiet puzzle about what we mean when we say something is the same thing over time. This is the paradox known as the ship of Theseus, and it has occupied philosophers for more than 2,000 years precisely because it does not feel like a trick question. It feels like it should have a straightforward answer, and yet the more carefully you think about it, the more that answer seems to slip away. The scenario itself is remarkably simple. Imagine a ship, an ordinary wooden sailing vessel, perhaps one that has served faithfully for many years. Like all ships made of organic materials, it requires regular maintenance. Wood rots when exposed to seawater. Planks crack under strain. Masts weaken over time. So the ship's caretakers do what any responsible owner would do. They replace the damaged parts. A rotting plank on the hull is removed, and a fresh one is fitted in its place. A few months later, another plank needs replacing. Then a section of the mast, then some of the rigging. Each repair is minor, sensible, the kind of thing that happens to ships all the time. The key detail is that this process continues. Year after year, the ship is kept in service through careful, gradual replacement. Each time a piece begins to fail, it is swapped out for a new one. The ship never stops being used. It never goes into dry dock for a complete overhaul. It never sits idle while being reconstructed from scratch. Instead, it remains continuously operational, always the same ship in appearance and function, always bearing the same name, always recognised by sailors and port authorities as the vessel it has always been. The replacements happen one at a time, spread out over months or years, so that at no single moment does the ship undergo a dramatic transformation. And yet, if you follow this process long enough, something unsettling emerges. Suppose the maintenance continues for decades. Every plank in the hull is eventually replaced, every timber in the frame, every piece of the mast and rigging, every nail, every fastening, every component that makes up the physical structure of the ship is at some point removed and substituted with a new part. The process is so gradual that there is never a moment when you could point and say, here is where the ship became something else. At every stage, it looked like the same ship. It sailed the same routes. It was commanded by the same captain, or at least by captains in an unbroken succession. It bore the same name painted on its hull. And yet, by the end of this long process of maintenance, not a single molecule of the original ship remains. Every physical piece that made up the ship when it was first built has been discarded and replaced. So here is the question that creates the paradox. Is it still the same ship? The immediate, intuitive answer for many people is yes, of course, it is the same ship. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no moment of destruction and recreation. The ship never ceased to exist, never stopped being used, never lost its continuity. From the perspective of anyone watching the ship over those years, it simply continued being itself, undergoing normal repairs the way any long-lived object does. If you walked down to the harbour to see the ship of Theseus, you would see a ship that looks right, functions correctly, and has a continuous documented history stretching back to its origin. In every practical sense, it seems to be the same ship. But another part of our thinking rebels against this conclusion. If literally nothing of the original ship remains, if every single piece has been replaced, then what exactly makes it the same ship? It is not the same physical matter. The wood that made up the original hull is gone. The metal fittings are different. Every atom that was present at the ship's construction has been removed. What we are calling the ship of Theseus now is made of entirely different stuff than what we called by that name originally. So in what sense is it the same? The name is the same, yes. The shape is the same, presumably. The function is the same. But is the ship itself the same? This is where the paradox begins to show its teeth, because it reveals that the word same might mean different things, and those different meanings can come into conflict. When we say two things are the same, we might mean they are made of the same material, the same physical substance, or we might mean they have the same form, the same structure and arrangement, or we might mean they have the same function, the same role and purpose, or we might mean they have the same history, the same continuous existence through time. These different criteria usually align. A chair is usually made of the same wood it was made of yesterday, still has the same shape, still serves the same purpose, and has existed continuously. But the ship of Theseus is a scenario where these criteria pull apart, and suddenly we have to decide which one actually defines identity. If identity is fundamentally about material composition, about the stuff something is made of, then the fully replaced ship is not the same ship. It is a different collection of matter that has been arranged to look and function like the original. Under this view, when you replace a plank, you're removing a piece of the ship and adding a piece of something else. Do this enough times and you have gradually subtracted the entire original ship and added an entirely new one. The fact that the subtraction and addition happens slowly, piece by piece, does not change the fundamental fact that the original matter is gone. A ship under this definition is its planks and masts and rigging, and when those are gone, the ship is gone, even if something very similar has taken its place. But if identity is fundamentally about form and function, about the shape and purpose of something, then the fully replaced ship is absolutely the same ship. After all, it has the same design, it performs the same role. If you showed someone a detailed blueprint of the original ship and asked them to identify which ship in the harbour matches that blueprint, they would point to the maintained vessel. The form has been preserved even as the matter has changed. Under this view, a ship is defined by its configuration, its structure, the way its parts are arranged to enable sailing. As long as that configuration is maintained, the ship remains itself, regardless of whether the individual components are original or replacements. And if identity is fundamentally about continuity through time, about an unbroken chain of existence, then again the maintained ship is the same ship. This is perhaps the most intuitive view for many people. The ship never stopped existing. It was never destroyed and rebuilt. At every moment in its history, there was a ship that everyone acknowledged as the ship of Theseus, and that chain of acknowledgement has never broken. The ship tomorrow is the same as the ship today, which is the same as the ship yesterday, which is the same as the ship the day before that. And if you trace that chain all the way back, it leads to the original ship. The fact that the material has gradually changed does not break the continuity. After all, rivers replace their water constantly, but we still speak of the Thames or the Nile as the same river over centuries. Each of these perspectives feels reasonable. Each captures something important about what we mean by identity, and yet they can lead to different conclusions about the ship. And that is precisely what makes this a paradox. It is not that there is a hidden correct answer we are failing to find. It is that our concept of sameness is itself more complicated than it first appears. And the ship of Theseus is a scenario that exposes that complexity by pushing the concept to a situation where its different aspects no longer align. But the paradox has a classic intensification, a twist that makes the problem even sharper. Suppose that as the ship is being maintained and its old parts are being replaced, those discarded original pieces are not destroyed. Instead, they are carefully preserved. Perhaps they are stored in a warehouse, or perhaps someone with a sense of history collects them. The rotting planks are set aside. The old mast is kept. Every original component is saved. And then, after the maintenance process is complete and the sailing ship has been entirely replaced with new parts, someone takes all those original components and reassembles them into a ship. Now there are two ships. One is the ship that has been continuously maintained, that never stopped sailing, that bears the name of Theseus, that has an unbroken operational history, but it is made entirely of new parts. The other is the ship that has been reconstructed from the original components, every plank and mast and fitting that was present when the ship was first built. But it has not been in continuous use. It sat disassembled for years while its parts were replaced one by one in the other vessel, and then it was put back together all at once. Which one is the real ship of Theseus? The question becomes much more pointed now, because we have two candidates, and presumably only one of them can be the true continuation of the original ship. Unless, of course, we are willing to accept that both are the ship of Theseus, or that neither is, or that the question does not have a determinate answer. But those options themselves require justification. The continuously maintained ship has a strong claim based on continuity and function. It never stopped being the ship of Theseus. At no point in its history was there a gap in its identity. Every day it was recognised and treated as the same ship it had been the day before. It has the operational history, the legal status, the social recognition. If there are records of the ship's voyages, those records document the history of the continuously maintained vessel. If someone owns the ship of Theseus, they own the ship that kept sailing, not the pile of old planks in the warehouse. From a practical standpoint, from the standpoint of how identity works in the world of human institutions and agreements, the maintained ship seems to have the better claim. But the reassembled ship has its own powerful argument based on material identity. It is made of the original stuff. Every piece of wood, every metal fitting that was present when the ship was first constructed, is now part of the reassembled vessel. If you believe that a thing is fundamentally the matter it is made of, then this reassembled ship is the real ship of Theseus, and the maintained ship is an imposter, a replica that happens to have a good backstory. The reassembled ship might not have the continuity of use, but it has the continuity of substance. It is the original ship in the most literal, physical sense, so we seem to have a conflict. Continuity of form and function points in one direction, continuity of matter points in another. And the paradox asks us to choose, or at least to explain why both answers might be acceptable, or why the question itself might be confused. This intensified version of the puzzle reveals something important. The ship of Theseus is not just about change over time. It is about what we think identity fundamentally consists of. What makes something the thing it is rather than something else? One tempting response is to say that identity is somehow a matter of both material and continuity, and that the paradox arises because these have been artificially separated. In normal circumstances, they go together. A ship maintains its identity by being made of the same stuff and by existing continuously. The paradox forces us to consider a scenario where these come apart, and perhaps in such a scenario, our concept of identity simply breaks down or becomes indeterminate. Maybe there is no fact of the matter about which ship is the real ship of Theseus. Maybe both are, and neither is. Maybe identity is a concept that works well in typical cases, but fails to give clear answers in unusual cases like this. But there is another perspective worth considering, one that shifts the focus away from trying to find the inherent metaphysical truth about which ship is really the same, and toward thinking about identity as something that humans assign based on purpose, context, and agreement. Under this view, identity is not purely a matter of objective fact waiting to be discovered. It is partly a matter of human practice, of the rules and conventions we use to classify and track objects over time. Think about how identity actually works in the world. Objects have names, but those names are given by people. Objects have ownership, but ownership is a social and legal construct. Records are kept, histories are documented, but those are human activities. When we say this is the ship of Theseus, we are not just reporting a metaphysical fact about identity. We are making a claim that fits into a network of social practices, legal frameworks, cultural understandings, and different practices might give different answers to the identity question depending on what they care about. From a legal perspective, the continuously maintained ship is likely to be considered the ship of Theseus. It has the unbroken chain of ownership. It has been registered and recognized continuously. The replacement of parts during normal maintenance does not change legal identity. Ships are repaired all the time, and we do not treat every repaired ship as a legally distinct entity. So if there is a dispute about ownership or rights, the law would almost certainly side with the maintained vessel. From a historical or archaeological perspective, the reassembled ship might have the stronger claim. If the goal is to preserve the actual original object, the actual physical artifact from the past, then the ship made of original components is the authentic one. Museums care about preserving original materials. A museum would rather have the reassembled ship made of ancient wood than a continuously maintained ship made of modern replacements, even if the maintained ship has the better historical documentation. In this context, material authenticity matters more than continuity of use. From a functional perspective, if the question is which ship can actually sail and perform the role that the ship of Theseus performed, the answer is probably the maintained ship. It has been kept in working order. The reassembled ship, having sat in pieces for years or decades, might need extensive restoration before it could actually function. If the identity question is about continuing the ship's purpose and role, then the maintained ship succeeds, where the reassembled one might not. So we can start to see that which is the real ship of Theseus might not have a single answer that applies in all contexts. Different contexts care about different aspects of identity. Legal contexts care about continuity of recognition and ownership. Historical contexts care about material authenticity. Functional contexts care about operational continuity. These different concerns can legitimately give different answers, not because anyone is making a mistake, but because the same ship is being asked to do different work in different settings. This contextual view of identity does not mean that identity is arbitrary, or that we can just decide anything is the same as anything else. The context matters, but so do the facts about continuity, material composition, form, and function. The point is that there is not a single metaphysical fact about identity that determines the answer independent of why we are asking. Identity claims are made for purposes, and those purposes can affect which features of identity are most relevant. And this observation about objects, about ships and their parts and their histories, begins to suggest something about a different kind of identity question entirely. Because human beings also change over time. Human bodies replace their cells constantly. Skin cells slough off and are replaced in a matter of weeks. Red blood cells live for a few months before being recycled. Even neurons, once thought to be permanent, can be renewed in some parts of the brain. Over the course of years, The vast majority of the physical matter that makes up a human body is replaced. And yet we do not think of ourselves as becoming different people because our cells have changed. Memories change too. They are not perfect recordings, but reconstructions that can shift and alter with each recollection. Beliefs and values can evolve over a lifetime. Personality traits can shift. The person you are at age 50 might have very different opinions, different priorities, different habits than the person you were at age 15. And yet we still speak of personal identity as continuous. We say, I am the same person I was as a child, even though almost nothing about us, physically or mentally, has remained static. The ship of Theseus becomes a mirror for thinking about the self. If the ship with all its parts replaced can still be the same ship, then perhaps a person with all their cells replaced can still be the same person. But what makes that continuity? It is not the physical matter, because that changes. It is not the exact thoughts and memories, because those change too. So what is it? One answer is that personal identity is based on psychological continuity. As long as there is a continuous stream of consciousness, a chain of memories linking the present self to the past self, then identity is preserved. This is similar to the continuity argument for the ship. The person you are today remembers being the person you were yesterday, who remembered being the person the day before, and so on back through time. Even though the content of those memories and the beliefs you hold might change, the chain of psychological connection remains unbroken. Just as the ship never stopped being recognized as itself, you never stop being recognized as yourself by your own consciousness. But there are challenges here too. Memory is fallible. People forget things, sometimes forget entire periods of their lives. Are they no longer the same person if the chain of memory is broken? People with dementia or amnesia can lose vast stretches of their personal past, and yet we do not typically say they have become different people, only that they have lost access to their own history. So perhaps personal identity cannot be purely about psychological continuity in the sense of memory. Another approach focuses on the continuity of the body, but not the specific cells or atoms that make it up. Instead, the focus is on the continuous physical and biological process. Your body is not just a collection of parts, but an ongoing dynamic system. Cells are replaced, but the pattern of organization continues. You are not the same cells you were years ago, but you are the same biological process, the same continuous living organism. This is more like saying the ship is the same, because it maintains the same form and function, the same organized structure, even as the material substrate changes. But this too has complications. If someone loses a limb, they are still the same person. If they receive an organ transplant, they do not become someone else. So clearly, not all of the physical structure is essential to identity. And what about the brain? Many people have the intuition that the brain is more central to personal identity than other organs. If your brain were somehow transplanted into a different body, most people would say that you, the person, would go with the brain, not stay with the original body. But the brain is also made of matter that changes over time, so the same questions about material versus continuity still apply. There is also the question of what makes personal identity matter. We care about whether we will continue to exist in the future. We care about whether the person who will wake up tomorrow is the same person who goes to sleep tonight. This is not just an abstract philosophical question. It affects how we think about responsibility, about promises, about planning for the future. If the person you will be in 10 years is the same person you are now, then you have a reason to care about what happens to that future person, to make decisions that will benefit them. But if personal identity is vague or indeterminate in the way the ship of Theseus suggests, what does that mean for these practical concerns? One response is to say that personal identity is not all or nothing. Perhaps what matters is not strict identity, but a relation of connection or continuity. The person you will be in 10 years is connected to the person you are now through chains of psychological connection, physical continuity, and causal dependence. Those connections are strong enough to ground the kinds of care and concern we associate with personal identity, even if there is not some metaphysical essence that remains perfectly identical through time. This is sometimes called the relation that matters view. What matters for survival, for responsibility, for prudential concern is not strict identity, but the right kind of continuity. But returning to the ship itself, the paradox does not just ask us to pick between material and continuity. It reveals that there are multiple ways of understanding what identity claims actually mean, and these different understandings can be formalized in different philosophical frameworks. One approach is called essentialism. This is the view that things have essences, core properties or features that make them what they are. For the ship of Theseus, an essentialist might argue that there is some particular feature, whether material origin, original design, or something else, that is essential to the ship's identity. If that essence is preserved, the ship remains the same. If it is lost, the ship has become something else. The challenge for essentialism is identifying what that essence is and justifying why that particular feature is privileged over others. Why should original material be the essence rather than continuous function, or vice versa? These choices seem somewhat arbitrary, unless there is a deeper principle to appeal to. Another approach is continuity theory, which focuses on identity as a relation across time rather than a property at a single moment. On this view, the ship of Theseus is not a single thing existing at different times, but a series of temporal stages connected by the right kind of continuity relations. The ship today is the same as the ship yesterday because it is connected to it by spatial continuity, causal continuity, and similarity. As long as these connections are strong, enough identity is preserved, even if the material changes. This approach handles gradual change well because each small step maintains strong continuity with the previous step. But it might struggle with the reassembled ship case because there the continuity is broken when the ship is disassembled, even though the material is preserved. A particularly interesting framework is called four-dimensionalism or perdurantism. This view treats objects as extended through time in something like the way they are extended through space. Just as a ship has a front and a back existing at different spatial locations, it also has a past and a future existing at different temporal locations. On this view, the ship of Theseus is not something that exists entirely at a single moment, and then persists by being the same thing at later moments. Instead, it is a four-dimensional object, a space-time worm that has different temporal parts at different times. The ship at the beginning of the maintenance process is one temporal part. The ship in the middle of the process is a different temporal part. The ship at the end is yet another temporal part. These are all parts of the same larger four-dimensional object. This might sound strange at first, but it has some appealing features. It explains how change is possible without loss of identity. The ship of Theseus can have different properties at different times, including being made of different materials, because those properties belong to different temporal parts. The four-dimensional whole contains all these parts, and that whole is the ship. When we ask, is this the same ship, we are really asking whether two temporal slices are part of the same four-dimensional object, and they are as long as they are connected by the right kind of continuity. Four-dimensionalism also handles the reassembled ship case in an interesting way. On this view, there might actually be two four-dimensional objects. One is the object that includes all the temporal parts of the continuously maintained ship, stretching from the original construction through all the repairs and beyond. The other is the object that includes the original ship, then goes through a stage of being disassembled into separate parts, and then is reassembled. These are two different four-dimensional entities, even though they overlap at the beginning. The question, which is the ship of Theseus, becomes a question about which four-dimensional object the name refers to, which might depend on context or convention. Yet another approach is conventionalism, the view that identity is partly or entirely a matter of the conventions and rules we adopt for classifying and tracking objects. On this view, there is no deep metaphysical fact about which ship is the ship of Theseus independent of our practices and purposes. Instead, identity is determined by the criteria we choose to use, and different criteria are appropriate in different contexts. Legal conventions might identify the ship one way, historical conventions might identify it another way. Neither is simply right or wrong. They are different conventions serving different purposes. Conventionalism does not mean anything goes. The conventions have to be coherent, useful, and applied consistently. But it does mean that when our conventions give conflicting answers, as they do in the ship of Theseus case, we should not necessarily expect there to be a single correct resolution. We might simply have to acknowledge that identity is context sensitive, and that different questions about the ship might legitimately get different answers. These different philosophical frameworks do not just offer different solutions to the ship of Theseus paradox. They represent different underlying views about what identity is and how it works. Essentialism says identity is about having the right properties. Continuity theory says it is about being connected in the right ways. Four-dimensionalism says it is about being parts of the same extended object. Conventionalism says it is about fitting the right criteria for the purposes at hand. Each framework has implications that extend far beyond ships and planks. They affect how we think about persons, about artifacts, about natural objects, about everything that persists through time. Consider a river. The water in the Thames today is not the water that was there yesterday. The molecules have flowed downstream, been replaced by water from upstream, and yet we say it is the same river. Why? Not because of material continuity, because the material is constantly changing. Possibly because of continuity of form, the river occupies the same channel and maintains the same general structure. Possibly because of continuity of process, the river is an ongoing flow of water through that channel. Different philosophical frameworks might emphasize different aspects of what makes the river the same river. Or consider a living cell. A cell maintains its identity while constantly exchanging matter with its environment. It takes in nutrients, expels waste, breaks down, and rebuilds its own components. The specific atoms that make up the cell are not the same from one moment to the next. What makes it the same cell is not material identity, but organizational identity. The cell maintains a boundary, a membrane that distinguishes inside from outside. It maintains a set of chemical processes that define its metabolism. It maintains information in its DNA that guides its structure and behavior. The identity of the cell is more about pattern than about parts. Or consider a more human creation, like a city. Is Paris the same city it was 500 years ago? The buildings are almost entirely different. The population is different. The political system is different. The language has evolved. What makes it the same city? Probably the continuity of location, the continuity of the name, the continuity of being recognized as Paris by its inhabitants and by the world. The identity of Paris is not about its physical components, which have changed completely, but about its continuity as a social and geographical entity. The ship of Theseus gives us a simple, clear case where we can see these issues in their purest form. No complications of consciousness, no debates about personhood, no messy biological processes, just a ship, some planks, and a question about what makes it the same ship. And yet that simple scenario opens up vast questions about the nature of identity itself. What emerges from thinking carefully about the paradox is that same is not a simple, unitary concept. When we say two things are the same, We might mean any of several different things. We might mean they are numerically identical, literally the exact same entity. We might mean they're qualitatively identical, having all the same properties even if they are distinct entities. We might mean they are continuous, connected through time by the right kinds of relations. We might mean they fall under the same classification, they are the same kind of thing. The ship of Theseus is a case where some of these meanings pull apart. Numerical identity might point one way, material identity another way, continuity yet another way. And perhaps the deepest lesson is that our everyday concept of identity works well in ordinary circumstances, because these different aspects usually align. Things are usually made of the same stuff they were made of before. Things usually maintain their form while maintaining their material. Things usually persist continuously without breaking apart and being reassembled. So we do not have to distinguish between material identity, formal identity, and temporal continuity. They all point in the same direction, and we can just say, it is the same thing, without worrying about what exactly we mean by that. The ship of Theseus is valuable not because it has a single correct answer that philosophers have somehow failed to find for 2,000 years, but because it exposes the complexity hidden in that seemingly simple phrase, the same thing. It shows that identity is not a simple binary property that things either have or lack. It is a cluster of different relations and properties that usually coincide but can come apart in unusual cases. When they do come apart, we have to decide which aspects matter most for the question we are asking, and that decision might depend on context and purpose. There is something almost restful about this conclusion. The paradox does not need to be solved in the sense of finding the one correct answer that makes all the others wrong. Instead, it can be appreciated as a window into how our concepts work, how language and thought handle persistence and change. The ship of Theseus teaches us to be more careful and more aware when we talk about things staying the same over time. It teaches us that same can mean different things, that identity is more nuanced than it appears, that continuity comes in different forms. And this awareness is useful not just for abstract philosophy, but for navigating the real world. When we think about whether a restored historical building is the same building, or whether a river that has changed course is the same river, or whether we are the same people we were years ago, we are grappling with ship of Theseus questions. The paradox does not give us a formula that solves all these cases, but it gives us tools for thinking about them more clearly. It helps us distinguish between material continuity, formal continuity, and historical continuity. It helps us see that different questions might legitimately care about different aspects of identity. It helps us understand that vagueness and context sensitivity in identity claims are not failures of our concepts, but features of how those concepts actually work. The ship of Theseus sails on, in a sense, through the history of philosophy. It appears in discussions of personal identity, in debates about artifacts and natural kinds, in questions about the persistence of nations and cultures and languages. It is a simple thought experiment that keeps generating new insights because it touches on something fundamental about how we think about objects in time. The ship does not need to reach a final port, does not need a definitive answer to which version is truly the ship of Theseus. The journey itself, the process of thinking through the puzzle, is what reveals the complexity of identity. Consider how this connects to our intuitions about originality and authenticity. We value original works of art more than copies. A painting by Rembrandt is worth vastly more than a perfect reproduction, even if the reproduction is visually indistinguishable. Why? Because the original has a different history. It was created by Rembrandt's hand. It has a causal connection to the artist that the copy lacks. In this context, material and historical authenticity matter enormously. The specific canvas and paint that Rembrandt applied are part of what makes it valuable. If you replace those with new materials, even if you perfectly preserved the image, you would have diminished its value as an original. But we also value continuity and use. A musical instrument that has been played continuously for centuries might be considered more valuable than an identical instrument that was built at the same time but sat unused. The played instrument has a history of performance, of use, of being part of living music. Even if its parts have been repaired and replaced over the years, it maintains a connection to that history of use that the unused instrument lacks. In this context, continuity of function and tradition might matter more than material originality. Different domains care about different things. This is not inconsistency, it is recognition that identity serves different purposes in different contexts. When we ask if something is the same, we need to know why we are asking. Are we asking for legal purposes, for historical purposes, for functional purposes, for sentimental purposes? The answer might legitimately vary depending on what matters in that context, and this points to something important about how concepts work in general. Many of our concepts are what philosophers call cluster concepts. They do not have a single defining feature that something must have to fall under the concept. Instead, they have a cluster of typical features, and things can belong to the concept by having enough of those features, even if they do not have all of them. Identity might work this way. There is a cluster of features associated with being the same thing: material continuity, formal continuity, historical continuity, functional continuity, spatio-temporal continuity. Typical cases have all of these. The ship of Theseus is unusual because it has some but not others, and so our concept does not give a clear verdict. This is not a flaw in the concept. Concepts do not have to give clear verdicts in every possible case to be useful. Language and thought are tools that evolved to handle typical situations. When we push into unusual edge cases, it is not surprising that our tools sometimes fail to give precise answers. The ship of Theseus is an edge case for the concept of identity. It is a scenario that our concept was not really designed to handle because in ordinary life, ships do not get every part replaced while remaining in continuous use. Nor do we typically save all the old parts and reassemble them. The fact that the concept does not give a clear answer in this case does not mean the concept is broken. It means we have reached the boundaries of where the concept applies clearly. And that is actually useful information. It tells us something about how the concept works, about what features it tracks, about what happens when those features come apart. The paradox is not a problem to be eliminated, but a phenomenon to be understood. There is also something to be said about the role of gradualness in the paradox. If the ship were destroyed and rebuilt from entirely new materials all at once, we would probably not hesitate to say it is a different ship, a replica. But when the change happens slowly, one plank at a time, it feels different. Each individual step seems not to change the identity. Replacing one plank does not make it a different ship. So how can a series of steps, each of which does not change the identity, add up to a change in identity? This is a version of a puzzle called the Bootstrap Paradox, or the paradox of the heap. One grain of sand is not a heap. Adding a single grain to something that is not a heap does not create a heap. And yet somehow, if you keep adding grains, you eventually do get a heap. How is that possible? The ship of Theseus has this same structure. The ship with one plank replaced is the same ship. Replacing one more plank does not change that. And yet somehow, after enough replacements, we might want to say it is no longer the same ship, or at least we are uncertain. The gradualness creates a puzzle, because it seems like identity should be transitive. If ship A at time 1 is the same as ship B at time 2, and ship B at time 2 is the same as ship C at time 3, then ship A should be the same as ship C. But if we follow that logic through a long chain of small changes, we end up concluding that the original ship is the same as the fully replaced ship, even though they share no parts. One response is to deny that Identity is always transitive in these cases of gradual change. Perhaps same ship is a vague predicate, one that does not have sharp boundaries. There is a range of cases where it is clearly true that something is the same ship, a range where it is clearly false, and a range in the middle where it is indeterminate. The fully original ship is clearly the same as itself. The fully replaced ship made of entirely new materials might be clearly not the same as the original. But somewhere in the middle, when half the parts have been replaced, or 2/3 or some other proportion, the answer might just be indeterminate. It is neither clearly the same nor clearly different. This indeterminacy might seem uncomfortable. We want clear answers. But indeterminacy is a feature of many concepts we use successfully. Consider bald. How many hairs can someone have and still be bald? There is no precise answer. Someone with no hair is clearly bald. Someone with a full head of hair is clearly not bald. But in between, there is a range where the answer is vague. The concept still works fine for most purposes. We do not need a precise cutoff to use the word meaningfully. Similarly, the ship of Theseus might simply be a case where the identity claim becomes indeterminate after enough change. This does not mean we cannot use the concept of identity. It means we recognize that it has limits, and that those limits show up in unusual cases like this one. For practical purposes, we can still make identity judgments in typical cases without worrying about the edge cases that arise in philosophical thought experiments. But there is also a question about whether the indeterminacy is in the world or in our language. Is it indeterminate whether the ship is the same because there is no fact of the matter, no objective truth about identity waiting to be discovered? Or is it indeterminate because our language and concepts have not carved up the world finely enough to give a precise answer? In this case, different philosophical views will answer differently. A realist about identity might say there is a fact of the matter, even if we do not know what it is or our language does not capture it precisely. Either the ship is the same or it is not, regardless of what we think or say. The challenge for this view is explaining what that fact consists in. What makes it true that the ship is or is not the same independent of any features we can point to? An anti-realist or constructivist might say that identity is not a feature of the world independent of our concepts and practices. Things are the same or different relative to the ways we classify and track them, and if our practices do not give a clear answer in some case, then there simply is no answer. Identity is something we impose on the world through our concepts, not something we discover in it. Most people probably fall somewhere in between these extremes. There seem to be real facts about continuity, about material composition, about form and function. But how we weigh these facts, which ones we privilege in making identity judgments, does seem to involve choices and conventions. So perhaps identity is partially objective, grounded in real features of the world, and partially conventional, dependent on how we choose to classify and track things. The ship of Theseus does not force us to pick one of these meta-metaphysical positions, but it highlights the question. When we ask, is it the same ship? Are we asking about something that has a determinate answer, independent of us? Or are we asking how we should apply our concept of sameness in an unusual case? The paradox can be seen either as revealing something about the nature of identity itself, or as revealing something about the limits of our concepts, or both. There is a certain comfort in recognizing that not every question needs a definitive answer. The ship of Theseus has puzzled people for millennia, and that is fine. It is working as intended. A good philosophical paradox is not one that gets solved and disappears. It is one that keeps revealing new layers, keeps prompting new ways of thinking, keeps showing connections to other problems and questions. The ship of Theseus does all of this. It connects to questions about personal identity, about the nature of artifacts, about how concepts work, about the relationship between parts and wholes, about the role of time in our ontology. Each of these connections opens up new avenues for thought, and in a way the paradox is also a demonstration of how philosophy itself works. Philosophy does not always provide final answers. Often it provides better questions, clearer ways of framing problems, distinctions that help us think more carefully. The ship of Theseus takes a simple question, is it the same ship? And reveals all the complexity hidden in that question. It shows us that we need to distinguish between material identity, formal identity, and temporal identity. It shows us that these can come apart. It shows us that context matters for how we evaluate identity claims. These insights do not solve the paradox in the sense of making it go away, but they help us understand what is going on, why the question is hard, what is at stake in different answers. Philosophy done well should make you see familiar things in new ways. The ship of Theseus does this. After thinking about it carefully, you might look at ordinary objects differently. You might notice the gradual changes they undergo. You might wonder about what makes them continue to be themselves. You might be more aware of the role that human practices and agreements play in maintaining identity. That enhanced awareness, that shift in perspective, is valuable even if it does not come with a tidy solution. And there is something almost meditative about sitting with a paradox like this. Not trying to force an answer, not rushing to judgment, but simply thinking through the different considerations, feeling the pull of different intuitions, noticing how they conflict and how they might be reconciled. This kind of careful, patient thinking is a skill worth developing. It helps in many areas of life, not just philosophy. Being able to hold multiple perspectives, to see the validity in different viewpoints, to recognize when a question does not have a simple answer, these are valuable cognitive abilities. The ship of Theseus invites this kind of thinking. It presents a scenario where multiple answers seem reasonable, where different frameworks give different verdicts, where intuition pulls in different directions. And instead of demanding that we pick one and dismiss the others, it allows us to explore why each answer has merit, what assumptions underlie each one, what would follow from accepting each one. This exploration is itself worthwhile, independent of where it leads. As a thought experiment, the ship of Theseus is remarkably durable. It has persisted through millennia, been discussed by countless philosophers, been adapted and modified in countless ways. And yet the basic structure remains compelling. A ship has its parts replaced gradually. Is it still the same ship? The question is simple enough that anyone can grasp it, yet deep enough that it continues to generate philosophical interest. This combination of accessibility and depth is rare and valuable. The paradox also demonstrates the power of thought experiments in philosophy. We do not need to actually build a ship and replace all its parts to learn from this scenario. We can explore it in imagination, considering different possibilities, tracing out implications, testing intuitions. This is philosophy as a kind of conceptual engineering, using imaginary cases to map the contours of our concepts, to see where they work well and where they break down. And the ship of Theseus has inspired numerous variations and extensions. There are versions involving people, where someone's brain is gradually replaced, neuron by neuron, with artificial components. There are versions involving nations, where a country's territory, population, and government all change over time. There are versions involving abstract objects like songs or stories, which can be performed or retold in different ways while arguably remaining the same song or story. Each variation tests our intuitions about identity in a different domain, and each can reveal new aspects of how we think about sameness and difference. The reassembled ship variation, sometimes attributed to the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, is particularly effective at sharpening the paradox. It creates a direct competition between two candidates for being the ship of Theseus, forcing us to choose or to explain why both might qualify or why neither does. This intensification moves the discussion from vague uncertainty to a more pointed dilemma, and it highlights the question of what identity claims are for, what work they do. If we say the continuously maintained ship is the ship of Theseus, we are privileging continuity and function. If we say the reassembled ship is the ship of Theseus, we are privileging material composition and origin. Each choice reflects something about what we think matters most for identity. In some ways, the reassembled ship case reveals that our intuitions about identity might be inconsistent. We might want to say that the maintained ship is the same ship, because it never stopped being used and recognized as such. But we might also want to say that the reassembled ship has a strong claim, because it is made of the original parts. Holding both intuitions simultaneously leads to contradiction, because both ships cannot be the one and only ship of Theseus if they are distinct entities. So we have to give something up, to revise our intuitions, or to accept that identity is more complex or context-dependent than we initially thought. This process of confronting conflicting intuitions and working through the implications is central to philosophical methodology. We start with intuitions, with pre-reflective judgments about cases. Then we test those intuitions against each other, against principles, against thought experiments. When conflicts arise, we have to decide what to keep and what to revise. The ship of Theseus is a case that generates such conflicts, and working through them helps refine our understanding of identity. It is worth noting that the paradox also has practical analogues in the real world. There are actual ships and buildings that have been maintained over long periods through gradual replacement of parts. The question of whether they are still the original is not just academic. It affects legal status, historical significance, cultural value. Museums face Ship of Theseus questions when deciding how to restore artifacts. How much can you replace before it is no longer the original artifact? Different institutions and different cultural contexts might answer differently, and those different answers reflect different values and priorities. Similarly, there are legal cases that involve identity questions similar to the Ship of Theseus. If a company gradually changes its ownership, its management, its business model, and its assets, is it still the same company for legal purposes? If a nation's borders, population, and government all change over time, is it still the same nation? These are not just abstract puzzles. They have real consequences for contracts, treaties, property rights, and international law. The philosophical analysis of the Ship of Theseus can actually inform thinking about these practical cases by clarifying what is at stake in different approaches to identity. In the end, the Ship of Theseus endures as a philosophical problem precisely because it resists easy resolution. It sits at the intersection of several important issues: the nature of identity and persistence, the relationship between parts and wholes, the role of matter versus form, the importance of continuity versus origin, the way our concepts handle vagueness and gradual change. Each of these issues is rich and complex in its own right, and the Ship of Theseus touches on all of them in a single elegant thought experiment. The beauty of the paradox is also in its simplicity. You do not need advanced training in philosophy to understand the basic question. You do not need technical knowledge or specialized vocabulary, just a ship, some planks, and the question of what makes something the same over time. And yet, from this simple starting point, vast territories of philosophical inquiry open up. This is philosophy at its best, taking ordinary questions and showing that they lead to extraordinary depths. For someone lying in bed thinking about the Ship of Theseus, there is a kind of peaceful fascination in letting the question unfold without forcing an answer. You can imagine the ship being repaired, plank by plank, over years and decades. You can think about the workers carefully removing old wood and fitting new pieces into place. You can picture the ship sailing between ports, always recognized as itself, even as its material composition slowly changes. You can imagine the discarded planks being collected and stored, waiting to be reassembled. And you can hold the question gently, what makes it the same ship? Not rushing to judgment, not insisting on a single answer, but simply exploring the different ways one might think about it. This kind of contemplative thinking, where you turn a question over in your mind without demanding immediate resolution, has value beyond philosophy. It cultivates patience, flexibility of thought, comfort with ambiguity. These are qualities that serve well in navigating a complex world where many questions do not have simple answers, where different perspectives can each capture part of the truth, where wise judgment often involves balancing competing considerations rather than applying a single rule. The ship of Theseus in this light is not just a problem to be solved, but an invitation to think deeply about something fundamental to how we understand the world. Objects persist through time. They change. We track them, name them, care about whether they continue to be themselves. And yet when we look closely at what that persistence and that identity consist in, we find surprising complexity. The ship is a vehicle, quite literally, for exploring that complexity. It carries us into philosophical waters where the familiar concepts of same and different begin to behave in unexpected ways, and we have to navigate carefully to make sense of what is happening. As you drift towards sleep thinking about these questions, the paradox might take on a different character, less urgent, less demanding of resolution. The ship sails on in your imagination, neither definitely the same nor definitely different from its original self, existing in a kind of conceptual twilight where our ordinary categories blur and soften. And that is fine. That is part of what the paradox teaches. Not everything needs to be definitively resolved. Some questions are valuable precisely because they remain open, because they keep inviting us to think again, to consider anew, to find yet another angle from which to view the problem. The ship of Theseus has been sailing through philosophical waters for more than 2,000 years now. It has been discussed by ancient Greeks, medieval scholars, early modern philosophers, and contemporary analytic metaphysicians. Each generation finds something new in it, some fresh insight or connection, and it will likely continue to engage thinking minds for millennia to come, because the questions it raises are not the kind that get permanently answered and filed away. They are perennial questions, questions that touch on fundamental features of how we think and how we talk about the world. In a sense, the ship of Theseus itself, as a thought experiment, has persisted through time in a way analogous to the ship it describes. The exact wording of the paradox has changed. The context in which it is discussed has changed. The philosophical frameworks brought to bear on it have changed. And yet we still recognize it as the same paradox, the same question about identity and persistence. Has it maintained its identity through all these transformations? By what criterion? The paradox applies to itself in a delightfully recursive way. And so the ship sails on through calm philosophical waters and through stormy debates, never quite reaching a final destination, always inviting new passengers to board and grapple with the question of what makes it the same ship. The journey itself is the point, the thinking, the questioning, the careful consideration of different possibilities, the recognition that our concepts are tools that work beautifully in ordinary cases but can perplex us at the edges. All of this is valuable. All of this enriches understanding, even without a final answer. As sleep approaches and thoughts begin to blur, the ship of Theseus might merge with other images, other questions, other gentle puzzles about identity and change. The ship becomes all ships, all things that persist through time while changing, all the ways we struggle to understand what makes something itself. And in that soft, drowsy state, the paradox loses its sharpness, becomes simply a wondering, a quiet musing on the strange and subtle nature of sameness and difference, of continuity and change, of the many ways things can be and cease to be themselves. The ship sails on into the night, into sleep, into the vast ocean of questions that have no final answers, but endless depths to explore. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything the paradox asks of us. To think, to wonder, to see the complexity in simple questions, and to rest in the knowledge that not all questions need to be answered to be worthwhile. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.